you a few minutes ago, we do not have a physical or an electronic quorum for this meeting. As such, we do have items. Staff is prepared to, and I just got word that Treasurer Lillard is on his way.
Oh.
So up to you if you'd like to give that a couple more minutes and we can formally call the meeting to order.
When he says he's on his way, are we talking 5 minutes or is his car driving in from Antioch? What are we doing?
I have a 5-word text message that says he is on his way.
Let's wait for it.
Okay, we'll just stand down for a few minutes and let him arrive. Okay.
Starting route to 623 Union Street. You can take voice votes instead of roll call votes.
Okay,
You can just say all those in favor, say aye, all opposed, nay.
that's good. Okay.
Mr. Stafford, did you get my directions, my instructions?
Your day just got a whole lot better. All right, you all. The first ever meeting of the Finance and Operations Committee is now called to order. And thank you, everybody, for being here. We will call the roll for attendance, please.
Commissioner Cope, Commissioner Cogan,
Here.
Commissioner Matlock, Commissioner Moser, Commissioner Stafford,
Present.
Treasurer Lillard,
Present.
Comptroller Mumpower.
Here.
Chairwoman, you have 4 members present and a quorum.
And with no virtual attendees, do we need to read the statement of necessity? That's right. Okay, fine. All right. The first order of business is the adoption of the agenda. I need a motion from someone and a second to adopt today's agenda.
So moved.
For a second?
Second.
All right. All those in favor? Signify by saying aye. Aye. Okay. Were there any nays? Okay. This segment for public comment. Dr. Gentile, have we received any requests for a public comment addressing the committee?
No, Madam Chair, we've not.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll move into the regular calendar. The first item on our regular calendar is election of a chair. I would ask if there are any nominations for a chairman of this committee, and it's my understanding that constitutional members can also chair these subcommittees.
Madam Chair, I'd like to nominate the treasurer.
Second.
Couldn't wait till you get here. Let's quickly confer with the treasurer and see if we should be willing to serve as chairman of this committee.
Well, I'm on 34 boards and commissions of the state right now, I think, and chair a good number of those, not all of them, but a good number of them. I suppose I would, I'm a glutton for punishment.
So all those in favor, Treasurer Lillard, chairing our committee, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Are there any noes? Oh, that carries with me, thank you. All want to swap chairs?
No, that's fine. Thank you. So, okay, we've got our agenda today, and we've got our script here.
He's got one.
So, okay. Let's see, we're going to take up our regular items here today. And we've got the operating state appropriation recommendations for 2024 and 2025. We want to have a little staff discussion about that. Who's going to present? You can present on this. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of minutes here for
Sure, Dr.
I just wanted to recognize that this is the first time we're having committees today, and as I said at the beginning of this today, the first committee, there will probably be some opportunities to improve the process today and to bring more clarity. I think we'll figure that out as we walk through this new process here in front of us. Two things. First of all, Mr. Jason Cavender is going to be the staff who's taking notes and minutes for tomorrow. He will, during the executive director report out on what was discussed here during this committee. Second, we'll bring a little bit more clarity, but I want to thank Scott, Sloan, and Rachel to try to make this into one notebook. The agenda for this is the third item in front of you, and the tabs, it's going to be a little off Roman numerally because the agenda item is for the committee here, but the tabs reflect tomorrow's committee meeting. And so if you go to regular calendar 2 tab, the first 3 tabs after that are related to today's agenda, and then the one immediately after that, Roman numeral 5, is as well. So, thank you. That's all.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
just in that we were talking about procedure there, if I can, just for my own and maybe everybody else's understanding as to how we're going to operate here, is the purpose of this committee to discuss the agenda items, potentially amend the agenda items, shape the items, and then at the commission meeting, the chairman of the standing committees will present them as worked up by this committee? Is that the concept?
Well, as Dr. Gentile said, I think we're feeling our way along the wall here on this in terms of the procedures actually involved. But, I guess from a legal standpoint, I don't know that this committee has any ability to actually amend something, I perceived it myself as being something where the committee would recommend amending something or something along that line, Council probably has views on that, so Scott, you want to talk to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir. Treasurer Lillard's exactly right. The committee in and of itself has no true statutory approval authority. However, we can go granular on the discussions, vet the matters out that are on the calendar. And if there is a committee vote in the affirmative to offer amendatory language recommending an amendment to the full commission for their consideration tomorrow, that would be acceptable.
So if we recommend an amendment, it would be something that travels with this item to the commission, and it's up to the commission whether to adopt it, so.
So anytime we take action, basically, it just becomes a formal recommendation.
That is correct, sir.
That's That's right.
Yes.
But I think it's a great format to use because we have the time today to do a deep dive into so many of these topics that we don't have time to do tomorrow. And we can do it in a group with staff expertise available as opposed to sitting in our homes, reading our agenda and going through our attachments.
Sure.
Right.
A really good format. I'm
Mr.
pleased.
Cogan's got a great point there, that would allow us to talk about how these items are formulated, the background on them, et cetera, so. All right, then I guess we're ready to go here since we've got some of that up going there.
Wonderful, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Van Zomeren, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy here at the agency to talk through the FY 24-25 State Appropriation Operating Recommendation. Every year when we make this operating request, we're looking at literally tens of thousands of data points, thinking about our outcomes-based funding formula, our strategic initiatives, our specialized units, you name it. It's all very data-driven. And I'm proud as a state of how data-driven our higher education finance policy is. But what we also know is that we can't get good data without good relationships. And I have some folks behind me, some folks behind you all who have helped make this budget happen. And I'd like to say a quick thank you to them, the fiscal staff here, THEC, the other THEC staff, our institutions, and of course, finance administration have all been great partners in this work. For our budget today, we have it broken down into 5 major categories that you see in front of you on the screen. Each year, the budget represents an opportunity for our staff and for this body to consider what problems higher education faces in any given year and how we can use fiscal policy to address them. Some of the problems that we're looking at in our state right now, stagnant enrollment, lower focus populations, the need to invest more in workforce readiness, all of these issues are things that we're looking to address in this budget. We're also looking for continuous improvement. THEC is at a time of great change right now. That's true in every single division across the agency. And some of the things that you'll see here in front of you today that I'll speak to are how we're working to improve our processes on the fiscal team as well. We'll start with that outcomes-based funding number. It's $17.0 million. This number is a good bit smaller than the request that we brought to you last year of $150 million and the year prior of $90 million. I want to just touch on that real quick to talk about why the number you're seeing here is smaller. First and foremost, we do not have a salary assumption included in our outcomes-based funding formula for this year. To be clear, we do anticipate that the state will have a salary file for FY25, but it's just not included in our funding formula in the way that it has been in years past. So the number that you see here is really reflecting outcomes, quality assurance, fixed costs, you name it, but not salary. Second, the last 2 requests that we've had have been large enough so as to buy down inflation, right? We've talked to you a lot in the last couple of years about inflation. Those requests were strategically managed such that we could set the tuition at 0 to 3 while keeping our institutions whole. This request does not necessarily take that approach, and we'll talk about that more in the next agenda item when we get to tuition. And lastly, our outcomes are flatter than they've been in years past. We can actually see that here now. Looking through our outcomes for this year, and you have some of this information in your packet as well. It's a simple table. Up green arrow, generally good. Down red arrow, generally bad. And we have a 1-year change on the left-hand column, a 3-year change on the right hand. Our formula looks at how an institution is doing, of course, relative to how they were doing last year, but we have that 3-year average, so it also matters how they were doing at this point 4 years ago. 3 years averaged here, 3 years averaged here. And what we can see is a couple of trends. We have our community college outcomes up here now. We see some pandemic effects are still playing through. So for those upper level progression metrics, looking at 36 hours and our associate degrees, those are down relative to where they were 4 years ago. They're also down relative to where they were last year. We have shorter term and non-enrollment based metrics are up, thinking about dual enrollment at our community colleges, job placements, workforce training, awards per 100 FTE. It's easy to understand why these outcomes might be more pandemic proof than some of the other outcomes that you see on the screen in front of you. Something certainly that we're proud of, that I know TBR is proud of, workforce training this year is up over 1 million hours. That's the first time since they've had workforce training contact hours in the formula that were up over 1 million hours. So a shout out to Dr. Jeff Sisk at TBR, who I know has been working with their team to get those numbers up. The outcomes-based funding formula, and of course, we have some reasons to be optimistic about future years. So these are situations where the outcome is up relative to where it was a year ago. That's great news. We're headed in the right direction, but it's not higher than where it was in 2019, 2020. Something to keep in mind as you think about the outcomes-based funding formula, especially for our community colleges. 18, 19, 19, 20, probably the best years that we have for our community colleges in terms of outcomes. And those are our comparison years when we look to now. So the community colleges through Promise and Reconnect were ticking up, up, up. And then of course the pandemic, sort of a hard come down. We're still sifting through that on the data side. It's of course not just about outcomes, but also focus populations. So thinking about how our formula works, we have the outcomes themselves, but we also award additional points for these focus populations. And here we can see a very similar chart, but just thinking about those focus populations. Are we producing more focus population points than we did in the year prior? And the answer by and large at our community college is no, right? We still have some pandemic effects playing through, especially in those progression metrics and associate degrees. There are some reasons, of course, that we could be more optimistic looking at certificates or maybe trending in the right direction, but down relative to where we were in 2019-20. I'm going to show you a lot of data today. The data that I'm showing to you right now might be one of the greatest concerns that we have as an agency, right? What this means functionally, and I know it's just a chart with some little arrows here and there, what it means functionally is that right now we have fewer adult students, fewer low-income students, fewer students who are underprepared, triggering these various outcome metrics at our community colleges. That's a great concern, of course, for THEC. We're going to talk about some of the budget items today that we hope will turn this tide and take it in the other direction, thinking about funding for TSA, for veterans, for Navigate Reconnect, thinking about workforce investment, which we have some requests in there as well. We also know that our partners at TBR are working diligently on this every day, investing a lot in high impact practices. We heard at our August board meeting how they're reinventing the community college experience, investing a lot in college coaching. It really is an all hands on deck approach between us, between THEC, TBR, and the state. Yes?
Russell, if I could stop you and ask a question. Unemployment is low,
Sure.
so these people are not in school. So I would assume that as a result of the pandemic, some kind of niche has been created and they're working from home or they found a better situation and they're making enough money that they're not feeling the need to go back to school. I mean, do we track any of these people? Would that be an accurate assessment or is that just one tiny piece of the puzzle?
It's a big piece of this puzzle, certainly. It is difficult to track who doesn't show up. We do have this conversation, and we have, I think, maybe some data to speak to this, looking at my colleagues around the room, but it's tough. When we think about the pandemic and how it played through, this is half the story. Wages were really high, especially for people who were in those lower income groups. We saw inflation actually drove up their salaries faster than it did for middle and upper income earners. That's a great incentive for them to stay in the workplace and not be in school. But the other thing we're seeing here is that it disproportionately affected our most disadvantaged students. So some people certainly are out there making $20 an hour, doing something else, and don't feel the need for higher education. My concern is when we're missing adult students, when we're missing low-income students, missing these students who are underprepared in 2020, 2021, 2023, we may not see them again in 2024 or 2025. It's harder to gain access to these students the longer they've been out of schooling. And so that's really my concern here. Certainly I'm happy that the wages have been increased, but we still know long-term, 10, 20, 30 years, that higher education credential is going to pay off, even if maybe it's not the strongest thing for you in this year.
Russell, continuing that thinking, so there's been a lot of conversation about the drop-off in male college-going members. And so if that's true with the four-year colleges and universities, I would imagine that's exacerbated for the community colleges. Are you seeing that as a factor as well, that there are fewer males going to college or post-high school?
We are. I think we have a college-going report written by Paige here behind me, who's been a wonderful colleague, and it'll show you exactly that. I think we have lost, our college-going rate is down more significantly for male students than it is for female students.
We have for the class of 22 seen, so last year's high school graduate class, this most recent one, seen a stronger rebound for men coming out of high school into college, but during the actual pandemic, it did plummet more so for men than women.
And then you'll probably get to this, there's also a lot of talk about the cliff.
Sure.
2025 sort of being the, I guess, the key year where we lose, or I should say the number of college-going students drops off precipitously because of the lower birth rates back 18 years ago. So is that also something that we are factoring in?
So it's not specifically part of our assessment of the formula, but it is something, of course, that we're talking to institutions about, especially as we think about enrollment. I think there are some factors here that mean that when we get to that cliff point, it's probably going to be less severe for our institutions here in Tennessee as it might be for colleagues in other states across the U.S. In general, the South has tended to have a higher birth rate, and that includes talking about this cliff. We also know Tennessee has a ton of in-migration from other states, people moving here. We're growing much faster. Those people often have college-age students. They're bringing them here. Those students go to a state college or university.
One other aspect of this is quickly, I know we didn't move on, but is to me is that whether the people who are not going to community colleges or other educational opportunities now, they may have a job and they may be making $15 an hour or something like that. But the question is whether if they have proper education, training, and skill and all that, they might make $35, $40, $50 plus an hour, And so how many of them are just under their potential educational level because the economy's good enough that right now they can go get a job immediately. It may not be the best job for them, but they got a job, So that's a little bit of an odd way to look at it, but I think it is something to be concerned about for us as a state because it has to do with our workforce readiness and how aligned that workforce is with what the needs of business, et cetera, are in the state. Come ahead, Russ.
All right, I'll move on to outcomes production at our universities. And here we can see the outcomes are a bit better, but there are some similar trends. Pandemic effects playing through in those upper level progressions and awards, bachelor's and associates. That 6-year graduation rate is down. When we think about who's included in this graduation rate, we're talking about first-time, full-time freshmen in 2017. These are students who would have been juniors by the time the pandemic hit. So maybe we're a little bit more susceptible to some of the effects that we saw from the pandemic than some of the prior classes. We'll be interested to see how this plays out in our graduation rate. For some of our institutions, they've actually been able to hold steady or even improve. For others, we have seen a slight decline in that graduation rate relative to the prior year. Our shorter term and graduate non-enrollment based metrics are up, thinking about the students accumulating 30 hours. We know at Tennessee State, at UTK last year were both historic years. I think that's playing through the data that we're seeing here. Master's and ed specialist degrees. We saw a lot of our universities pivot to graduate education during the pandemic, and that's playing through our formula, and as well as research and service. We have a lot of institutions investing a lot of time, energy, and resources there.
Russell, if I can, real quick. That was the most interesting trend I saw during the pandemic was the master's degrees recipients enrollment skyrocketed in fall 2020. MTSU was up, I think, like 100% or so in their number of graduate degrees. And part of it was institutional strategy, but also there were the same reasons that kept those coming out of high school away from college. You got a lot of workers working from home who decided to do online enrollment as well, and that increased during the time frame. We're seeing that now in the outcomes.
The degrees per 100 FTEs gone down both 1 and 3 year averages.
Yeah, so there's some quirks with the degrees per 100 FTE. In theory, it is an efficiency metric that allows us to understand how many of your students that you bring in are actually earning degrees. And it does do that to some extent, but what can happen is something like what happens last year. Let's say TSU, UTK, they skyrocket their FTE in a very short amount of time. Well, that means your denominator has grown a lot. Your numerator probably is not going to grow that quickly. It's going to take time for these students to graduate. And so you'll end up with something like this. That's half the story. The other half is that our bachelor's and associates are down, and so that does, in theory, also lower your degrees per 100 FTE. And of course, a few reasons to be optimistic for future years, things that are trending in the right direction. Looking at our focus populations at our universities, again, it's a bit better here than what we've seen at the community colleges. There are still some pandemic effects playing through. Something to think about with this 90 credit hours, a lot of the students who trigger this outcomes at our universities are actually community college students who have transferred over. So when we think about transfer being down in their community colleges, which it is, we saw that a few slides ago, that also affects what we're seeing here at our universities, especially thinking maybe some of those community college students would have been more likely to hit adult or a low income, whatever it might be. With the other metrics, we're down relative to where we were pre-pandemic, but headed in the right direction. And so that's something we're excited about. Of course, at the end of the funding formula every year, we end up with this distribution of funding, recommendation for how, no matter how much money we receive from the state, we allocate the funding for any given fiscal year. And each of these institutions is sort of telling its own little formula story. For ETSU, we can see a steady growth over time, right? Every year kind of ticking up, ticking up, ticking up. We also know that other institutions have different stories. Our community colleges experienced great growth and then reached their high in 21, 22, and since then have been slowly declining. Something that we do is we travel the state, reaching all of our institutions, is we share these stories with them. Every institution, like I said, has their own sort of OBF story. Some of that is really positive stories that we're excited to share with the campuses. Some of those are real challenges, and we address those when we're out there talking to presidents or whoever else it might be. I'll pause here. Questions on outcomes-based funding or the 17 million? Let's talk about our specialized units. So our specialized units request for this year is $7.6 million. 3.7 of that goes to the medical education units that you see up here. I believe 3.9 goes to these research and service units, right? When we think about our specialized units, they all have their own formula sheets. In general, we're measuring various cost drivers. So typically we're gathering data on utilities, rent, equipment, maintenance and operation, things like that to drive the requests for these particular units. Something you'll see up here, again, our list of specialized units, we do have UT Southern as a specialized unit. We anticipate that by 2025, they will be rolled into the formula. Again, that's really a data issue right now. Practically, we would have loved to have had them in the formula from the day they became part of our system, but functionally, there's some data quirks that we have to reach or get through in order to make that happen.
Russell, this is 100% of the population of specialized units, none are excluded, right?
That is correct, yeah. I talked about opportunities for us to be improving our process, and one that we're really proud of, we've partnered with Finance and Administration, ETSU, and UT, many thanks to all of our partners in that work, is revising the way that we request funding for our medical units. On the left, you can see the formula that we used for FY24, and I think had used for decades prior. The formula you see on the right is much more streamlined and in alignment with the specialized units that I showed you on the prior page. So thinking about our medical units, really just boiling it down to these 5 things and better understanding, okay, if we can measure these, sure.
Oh, no.
Okay, yeah, if we can measure these, we can get to something like what are the non-salary operating costs that our institutions face? Just like with outcomes-based funding, we don't have a salary request for these units, right? And so we do anticipate that the administration will have a salary file that'll flow separately. The request you see in your materials is specifically for non-salary operating, talking about our medical units.
And when he's talking about improving our processes, it's always good to know like what's informed us of the need to do so. This was a persistent request that we received from the administration, from FNA, as well as Senate and House finance committees to trying to get at the actual true cost drivers of medical units. There was an understanding that the formula we had just wasn't a compelling narrative for that. And that's what we've been trying to create here, so that's more compelling for it to capture those true cost increases.
Exactly right. Moving on to our strategic initiatives. So each year we request strategic initiatives. These are ideas, plans, programs from our campuses or boards, things that they think will make higher education better, or in some cases that we think will make higher education better as we run strategic initiatives as well. I'll walk through them here now. We have $50.9 million in total. $1 million of that is recurring for the Tennessee Institute of Agricultural and Environmental Research. That is to ensure that the state is able to meet the federal match requirements that we have for this unit. We also have a $2.5 million request for the ETSU College of Pharmacy. As you all will recall, FY24, the fiscal year that we're currently in, is the first year that ETSU is receiving state funding. It's $2.5 million. That's a great investment in our College of Pharmacy, and we're excited to see that money there. What we know is that relative to the other specialized units, ETSU is still a good bit behind where they're at in terms of appropriation. This additional $2.5 million would put them on par with our other specialized units, allow them to lower tuition for their students, and in theory, offer a better product at a lower cost to Tennessee students.
Sorry, Russell.
Sure.
Some background history context here with ETSU College of Pharmacy. This was approved as a unit back in the mid-2000s, mid-aughts. And our commission back then said, we will approve this as an entity, but it is to get no state funding. It would be essentially a private institution that's in statute as a public institution and operated by a public institution. For a few years, ETSU has been trying to get that funding after 15 years or so, and they finally got it last year. And so now, as staff, we recommend, well, if you're going to fund them as a public entity, let's fund them like we fund our other specialized units as well. That's the background.
Why was it started as a private institution?
There's a fun political history there, as I believe, but there was a need from that, an identified need from that area of the state for a college of pharmacy. That I believe there was a pharmacy study done back then that it was not, Jason Cavner, he was here back then. It was not recognized as a need for the state to fund. And so there was an agreement from the state that they can operate but not receive state funding. That's now changed in the last General Assembly session.
We had a similar situation, but in a different context, with the acquisition of Lambuth University. We agree that we're not going to put some of the state capital dollars into Lambuth when the University of Memphis took it over.
That's right.
Of course, we've got, in this year's budget, we've got an appropriation for that. I noticed. So.
At some point, I don't remember if there was a limit on that for how long that would not receive capital. But yes, sir.
But eventually, all these things return to the state. It's just a question of how long it takes.
Actually, sir, if I may, that was a conversation this morning in the committee meeting about site campus locations. When we approved, why do we approve them? A part of the conversation was, should that be delegated to begin with to the staff? But also because at a certain point, there will be capital needs that come to this body as well, and to the state.
We have two requests for the UT system. The first one you'll see up there, $3 million for the Institute of Agriculture. This is to invest in precision livestock farming. Farming is apparently a much higher tech industry, certainly than I realized, maybe than many of us realized. This money would position them as a national leader in precision livestock farming, in data science, and artificial intelligence. We also have a $1.5 million non-recurring for the UT Health Science Center. This is their CHIPS agency, and it would invest in really training, upscale a lot of the equipment that they have on hand, make sure that their employees are some of the best trained in the state, and making sure that their healthcare outcomes for Memphis and for the state are top tier. For our TBR strategic initiatives, I'm going to throw this on here before our friends at TBR have a heart attack. We have two potential amendments to consider today. I'll get to those in a second, but let's talk about the actual items themselves. We have $1.6 million for the Student Support Network. What this would do is place both a counselor and a social services manager at all 13 of our community colleges. So it's 26 people in all, plus one staff member at TBR to manage them. These people will handle the mental health as well as just general life needs of their communities, serving not only that community colleges, but students at the surrounding TCATs as well. We have a 3.0 million non-recurring request for workforce training financial aid. As you all know, a lot of these non-credit credentials that our institutions offer are not eligible for state or federal financial aid. This would be a pilot program to explore offering financial aid for these programs so that students can come in at an even lower cost. I think lineman is often the example that gets thrown around. Enter a lineman program, have financial aid associated with it, graduate at little to no cost.
So with regard to the counselor, that's one per school.
Yes.
And that's a pilot. At some point, do we think that we might get to a pro rata number so that it's comparable with small schools versus the larger schools?
That's a great question. To be honest, I don't know. That would be a conversation for us to have with TBR to know, okay, is 2 staff members for community colleges the right number? Should we have more at our institutions that have much larger student populations, fewer at the locations that are a bit more sparse?
Because that's the challenge that they have in public high schools today, right? There's not enough counselors to go around, and thus you've got students that fall through the cracks.
I think that's exactly right. What I would imagine, having not talked to TBR about this, is that this is really setting a floor. We are going to have something in every single community that we are serving. We may still need to do more, to your point. Some of these locations have a lot of students. Maybe they actually do need 2 counselors, and we talk about that a year, 2 years, 3 years from now.
I remember from your presentation to the Board of Regents, they talked about the goal of getting a certain ratio of students to counselors. So that is on their radar. There's, I think it's 250 to 1 or so, maybe 500 to 1. That's the ideal ratio they're going for.
The last request you see here is 3.3 million recurring. That amended value is 3.8, and this is creating a multi-generational workforce pipeline. This is for them to be able to reach out to students. The example they gave at their board meeting is thinking about Trucking Tennessee, a wildly successful initiative that they were able to run a year or 2 ago. They had a great program. The trucking program was already strong, but getting the word out on that program is really valuable, especially when we think about some of these students who might be harder to reach, adult students or students in our rural areas. This would build on that model, centralize a lot of this work, and then allow them to reach out to students from the TBR office, people who might be interested in TCAP programs, short-term credentials, whatever it might be. You see the 2 amended values there. We'll return to this at the end of the presentation. This is a different number than what you have reflected in your material, so if this body wishes to amend those values up, we'll have to do a vote. We have one last strategic initiative. This is $35 million in non-recurring for cybersecurity. This is something that actually THEC is bringing forth on behalf of THEC and the institutions. Thinking about cybersecurity at our institutions, President Randy Boyd from the UT system during the governor's presentation last week talked about the UT system receiving almost 1 million hits a day, 1 million attempts for hackers to break in to their system every single day. Quick math says 365 million a year. That's a lot of hits, a lot of things that could go wrong on any given day. What we know from data from IBM is that one successful hit could cost an institution about as much as $3.7 million. That's the average. Could be more, could be less. And so what we're attempting to do here is make sure that our institutions have every possible entity that they could need to make sure their cybersecurity is as strong as it could be, right? So this would be a $35 million non-recurring request to ensure the institutions can invest in additional software, whatever cybersecurity, firewall, servers that they might need to make sure their campuses are as safe as possible.
How did they determine 35 million? I'm sure that they came up with
35 million is our number, and it's a great question. We struggled with this, figuring out exactly what the right number is in any given year. We know from data, again, from IBM, a lot of entities, businesses will spend 3 to 4% of their annual revenue on cybersecurity. That would have been a very large number if we were to bring that number in front of you. And so what you're looking at here is actually about 1% of the total operating for higher education in a given year. We'll take 1% and use that strategically this year to make sure that our institutions have additional funds for cybersecurity.
That's helpful because you're right, the fight is ongoing and
It is.
you pour millions and billions of dollars toward this effort. It's still not make a good defense against the hackers.
Our last couple items for you. So we have some agency requests as well. The challenge before our staff and before this body in any given year is to think through, to think through those challenges that I talked about at the opening of this presentation. What are the things that higher education is struggling with, and how can we address them with our resources and through strong fiscal policy? 2 data points that help us think through this. On the left, the current labor force participation rate by education level. You saw Dr. Gentile present this in front of the governor last week. I did create this slide, not that it matters, but it is my slide. What we know is that students who have higher levels of education are also more likely to be in the workforce, right? So we're not just talking about, we talk a lot about higher education as a benefit to students, and it definitely is. We have so many data points that suggest higher wages, longer life, better health outcomes, you name it. It's also a great benefit to the state when we think about ways that we can increase our labor force participation rate. Additional education for our Tennesseans is a great way to be spending our money. In the second slide, you can see the change in net price at our community colleges by family income level. And what you're seeing here is that net price has decreased, in some cases dramatically, since the inception of Promise, which is great. That's exactly what we hoped would happen. But there is one group for whom that is not true, are students making $30K or less in a given year. And it makes some sense. These are students who were likely to be receiving college for free through Pell and other grants already, even before Promise went statewide, but they still have to pay for housing, food, transportation, you name it. The benefits from Promise and that free tuition have not necessarily reached this group. And we have some ideas today that I think can help solve that problem. Looking at our agency requests, we have $5.4 million for advised TN. This would expand our advised TN work to reach an additional 10,000 students. We would be in feeder middle schools as well, allowing us to be in almost all swaths of the state talking to students about the benefits of going to college. We also have a $500,000 request recurring for Veterans Reconnect. This allows us to do 3 things. This allows us to do 3 things. There's a portal that veterans can use that will allow them to assess which institutions could I go to that will value and give credit for the service that I've done, the training that I've done as a military member. Some institutions are great about this. The portal helps these veterans find those institutions, right? We also have a Vets Reconnect conference. It's a 2-day event. It brings everybody in the state who might be a part of a higher education entity working with veterans together to talk about what's working, what's not working. This would fund that as well. And then finally, we have a grant program. We've allocated over $6 million since 2015 towards our institutions to help them solve vet problems. Some of this money will go towards that as well. We had planned to continue investing in veterans in the state of Tennessee with this money. We have $3.5 million non-recurring for affordable instructional materials for workforce readiness. I mentioned a second ago the Promise situation. We know that Promise has brought down the net price for a lot of our students, but maybe for those lowest income, it has not. And thinking about why that might be, again, housing, food, transportation, but textbook costs are also a huge part here. And so what this money would allow us to do is to work with our campuses, set up programs that they can be creating a program that is low or perhaps no instructional costs. I could make it through the entire program, graduate with my diploma, certificate, degree, without having paid for a single textbook. That's a good portion of this. I think there's also money in here to bring folks together to talk about best practices around affordable instructional materials. We have $885 million for Navigate Reconnect. In 2015, we gained funding for Navigate Reconnect, which is wonderful. This program has been an absolute boon for our agency in thinking about the work that we do and how we reach students. What I know is that the money that we have in FY24 is the exact same amount of money as we had in FY 2015. And so over time, the purchasing power of some of those salaries, our Navigate reconnectors, all 17 of them are doing fantastic work, but they haven't really had a market rate adjustment commensurate with what we've experienced in inflation. Part of this will address that. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the Tennessee Student Assistance Award. So I've talked a lot about low-income students and their needs in the last 20 minutes that we've had together. One of the best things we can do for them is invest in TSAA. The federal government is redoing how they measure students who are Pell eligible. What that's going to mean for our state is we probably have even more students who are Pell eligible in the coming years than we have in the past. Right now, we know that 2/3 of our TSA students make $30,000 or less. I think something like 3/4 make $40,000 or less. These truly are the Tennesseans who maybe have the most financial needs in order to go to college, and TSA helps on top of Pell to do that. We think about the success of our emergency grants in the state, which have been wonderful. TSA operates as a preemptive emergency grant. It'll go on top of Pell, it'll go on top of Promise. Students can get the TSA award and use that money for some of the costs that I've talked about. Housing, food, transportation, textbooks, you name it. It's a $35.9 million recurring request. With that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Any questions, discussion points about this? Talk about just for a minute the procedure in terms of how the staff works on this at THEC level. Once you receive an operating budget request, from a university or an educational unit, what is your procedure for analyzing that, et cetera? What steps do you go through?
Sure. Are you talking specifically about the strategic initiatives or the budget overall?
Both, really,
So budget overall, again, we have a couple of big buckets up here. Outcomes-based funding is time-consuming, but pretty cut and dry, right? We put all the numbers, tens of thousands of cells together, and it spits out one number. That's the 17 million that you see in front of you here. It also tells us how to distribute that 17 million. So in terms of conversations with the institution, it's relatively limited, and it tends to be around those fixed costs. We do still have some fixed costs in the formula, conversations about building, plant size, yada, yada. But there's not a ton of conversation to be had there. Similar at our specialized units, I talk about our requests being data-driven. You look at OBF, you look at those specialized units, there's not a ton that anyone can do in one direction or another to influence the request. We pull the data, we run the numbers. Statewide system priorities is where we need to have a conversation, these strategic initiatives. Every year, our institutions submit strategic initiatives to us. Actually, this year, you have an interesting thing in your packet. We will sit down as an agency with the executive staff, talk about what are our state needs, what are the problems we have in higher education, and then do we find things in our strategic initiatives that we feel like are addressing statewide needs. So hopefully, of course, these strategic initiatives help the campus in some way, but also we know that it's a statewide endeavor, right? That's why this body exists to begin with. So we're looking for things that really do improve the state overall. You have in your strategic initiatives this year the list of things that we looked at but did not necessarily move forward with. So on that strategic initiatives page, you have one page that is THEC recommended strategic initiatives. The second page is all the things that were submitted to us but that have not been put forward, and so you can kind of see what our thinking was on a few of those.
So if I can, sorry, sir. The reason for that new change, we're going to show you everything, is because another part of our responsibility and duty is to be transparent to the state. These are things that you might hear, Austin P might sidle up to you and talk to you about this year. We just want to be transparent about that.
There are, of course, in any given year, interesting one-offs, thinking about cybersecurity. That's a need that we recognize. We don't expect to request cybersecurity money every year, but in some years it makes a lot of sense for us. Similar thing with TSAA. This is sort of a unique situation with the way that the FAFSA is going to be administered. We know that we will have a need, an unmet need, if we do not have additional dollars for this program looking to FY25, FY26, and beyond.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Great presentation, and I certainly agree with the cybersecurity. Talk about when THEC staff are making a value judgment, which is ultimately what it is when you come up with a priority list. How do you work to stay objective? How do you decide what weight to put where? When you talk about it being a statewide program, how do you, the staff, seek to be sure we're offering things geographically accessible? Things like that.
Yeah, it's really, so thinking specifically about the strategic initiatives, we don't tend to craft something whole cloth that an institution has not submitted to us. So typically, we'll get 2 to 3 requests from UT, from TBR, from some of the LGIs. And so we're really working from the lists that they send us. Sometimes those requests will be rather large. You have in that second page some pretty large strategic initiatives. Sometimes those requests might be small. Thinking about the CHIPS program, 1.5 million non-recurring. That would come off the books next year. The way that THEC staff are working to sort of shed what biases we can is to sort of take that state lens. How would this improve the state as a whole? What we want to see are ideas that are creative, innovative, and that would serve Tennesseans as a whole. So again, you look at that sheet that has things that maybe didn't make the cut. What you'll find are things that either we are addressing in other ways, so thinking about cybersecurity, thinking about campus safety, or you might also find things that are not really innovative, to be frank, that wouldn't necessarily move the needle on anything that we can quantify or measure. Does that answer your question? There were a couple
Sure.
of things
Speak specifically to the geographic distribution, because I get, you look at things that make an impact. Of course, I live in Bristol, which is closer to Toronto, Canada, than Memphis, Tennessee. So if we have initiative investments, in the western part of the state, for example, that's a long way for a Tri-Cities student to be able to benefit, or vice versa. So I'm just curious what thinking goes specifically into that. And I understand that, there might not be an institution in a certain part of the state that even submits a request. So I understand you don't always have that ability to choose. I guess I'm just wondering what kind of thinking goes in there. When you think about accessibility, Tennessee's a long state.
I've driven it a couple of times. Yeah, it doesn't get any shorter.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. So there's a bit of backstory here on the strategic initiatives specifically, which is that when we created them, they were targeting these specialized units, that list of specialized units that I showed in the slide deck earlier. And so we expected to see requests from those specific specialized units, thinking back pre-focus when TBR still had specialized units, right? The boards at that point, TBR and UT, would submit requests on behalf of those specialized units, or THEC would put something forward like cybersecurity that is a statewide request. All of our institutions will get some of that cybersecurity money. And so the distinction on geography would have been left to the boards. UT has institutions all across the state. Well, they may not submit a strategic initiative for every single one of their institutions. They may pick a few here or there, and then we will sort of decipher, okay, what makes the most sense here. Same thing with TBR, thinking about the specialized units at TSU. That's here in Nashville. Every time TSU would submit something for a strategic initiative, it's going to be for one of their units. Presumably here, I guess they have some further reach, but yeah.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, I think this is one of those areas that has not had as formal of a process as, say, capital has. We prioritize because, as Mr. Van Zomeren mentioned, these projects, strategic initiatives, are for actually a very narrow set of institutions. ETSU, TSU with their ag and medical units, TBR and UT as systems overall. And so I think in the future, we started exercising this year more so than we have in prior years, where we've looked at true needs that we've identified as a state to recommend projects that kind of align with the state needs. I think in future iterations of this, we could have more clear criteria that we give to institutions at the front end as to what would be a selection for it.
Okay, Russell, while we're on this subject, let me ask you about the flip side of what I asked you about a minute ago. I asked you a minute ago about, procedures when you receive a request from the university. On the other hand, post-appropriation, does the staff do any review of expenditures post-appropriation, i.e. further down the road to see was it effective, did it achieve the goal that was stated at the time, et cetera?
It's a great question, and it really depends on the allocation. For something like outcomes-based funding formula, in some ways we're evaluating it every single year and seeing how effective it's been, but we aren't specifically going out to an institution and saying, here's the money. For something like cybersecurity, this money would come to THEC and be distributed out to our institutions. That is something that we absolutely are going to want to know from our institutions. How did you spend that money, and what was the impact for your campus?
Right. Well, and I would suggest Treasury does risk management for state government and higher ed, and we are always responding to cyber issues involving colleges, TCATs, universities. So yeah, there's a need there for that. But I wonder, like expenditures that y'all are going to make, and the state's going to make in that area, how effective it really is, at the end of the day. You're looking back over several years, for instance, I'd say that would be something that the commission ought to look at in the future, Okay, does anybody have anything further on this?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I will say I'm texting furiously to negotiate a longer ability to stay. I'm failing miserably. So I'm about to leave. I mean, if we're at a point where we want to have a vote
Yeah, I
on this
think we
issue.
are just about here at the point that.
But then I'll have to excuse myself and maybe back, maybe back. It all just depends.
All right. So do we have anything further on this particular point? Russell, anyone? Item number 2, the 2024-25 operating state appropriation recommendation.
Chairman Willard, we would want to, as Mr. Van Zomeren referenced, a couple of small amendments to the materials.
Okay.
And he can reference those for you again then.
Okay, let's go through those right quick here.
Yeah, so we have an amendment to agenda item 1. The committee would vote to amend the 2 strategic initiatives at the Board of Regents. The request for the Tennessee Board of Regents Student Support Network would be amended from 1.6 to 1.8 million. The request for the Tennessee Board of Regents creating a multi-generational pipeline would be amended from 3.3 to 3.8 million.
Okay, so with that, the chair would move a recommendation to approve a recommendation by this committee to the full commission of the operating state appropriations recommendations that have been outlined here today with the amendments that Russell read. So is there a second?
Second.
Second, Dr. Richard Stafford. Discussion, seeing none, all in favor. We have to call a roll on this, or we can do it otherwise. Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Matters adopted. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, again, let me know, I'm going to slip out, maybe back. Didn't know quite what to expect today with our first one, but certainly appreciate it very much.
I certainly got a surprise when I came.
We lost our form, so we can't transition. It's just sort of a work session.
Yeah, it's a work session. Yes. At this point. We'll hope our quorum will return here shortly. So.
Is that my new nickname?
Yeah, Comptroller quorum, you're the man. All right, item number 3, the 2024 providing tuition fees ranges recommendations.
So continuing on to the next calendar item, as you all are well aware, each year this body sets a binding tuition range for tuition and combined tuition and mandatory fees. During the November meeting, we typically set a guiding range to allow the institutions some idea of where this board might intend to head should the appropriations request be met. Quick history of where we've been. You can see the sector growth in tuition and fees. That dotted line there is when the commission gained binding tuition authority and first used it to set that 2018-19 tuition year. We can see that tuition's been relatively low since the board has had this power, and no year has it been greater than 3%. The black box is just showing something that's a little easier to see on this next slide, that we're really at a multi-decade low, thinking about tuition. We're not that far away from times when annual tuition increases would easily be in the double digits, sometime as high as 20%. What we've seen in the last 7 to 8 years, and especially during the board's time with the tuition authority, is much lower. Again, something in that 0 to 3% range. What that's allowed us to do, I think I have some 35 slides to present to you today, and this one is my favorite. It's yeah. Maybe for tomorrow. I've got a few items. This one by far is my favorite, and there's a reason for that. What we're showing here, of course, the nominal cost of tuition increases just about every year, right? So the sticker price for our students is moving up and up and up, and we've seen that. But the real costs today for our students are as low as they've been in a decade. You think about the FY23 request, $130-something million, 0% tuition. That's something that this board voted on. We talk about measuring the impacts of the things that this board is doing. Here's a great one, right? Real tuition costs as low as they've been in a decade. Still much higher, of course, than they were the decade prior, but we're headed in the right direction. We combine that with this other slide, which is my second favorite slide, the Composite Financial Index. Each year, we're measuring our institution's financial health in a number of ways, but one of our favorites is this Composite Financial Index. It's 4 different ratios that you can see up on the screen in front of you there, all combined into one, and in general, it's measuring how healthy are my institutions. Institutions at or above the blue mark, really healthy. Institutions below the red mark, not so healthy. And so what we see here is that all of our institutions are in great health. In fact, we have 20 years of data, Composite Financial Index data, for our institutions. This is as healthy as we've been. Our institutions have done really well. So to do what we did on the prior slide, lower the real costs of tuition for our students, while also ensuring that every one of our institutions is financially healthy. Apologies, TBR is not on here, but they are also financially healthy by this index. It is a great success for the board. Looking at this year's tuition range, things that we might consider, when we pulled inflation to run the formula, the core CPI was at 4.4%, so that's the number that gets baked into our operating request for the year. 4.4% is much lower than it was a year ago, 6.3% when we came to you this time last year, but still we're talking about 3 decades highs, like to go back far enough that you would find another 4.4 or above, you'd have to go back to the 90s, right? So inflation's still high, although pressures are calming. What that means functionally is the same thing that it means for anyone in this room. Our institutions need more revenue this year and in the coming year to maintain revenue neutral, adjusted for inflation in any given year. A key factor that I always want to throw out here and have the board consider when we talk about the tuition recommendation, when the state approves a 1% salary increase for state agencies, that's funded at 100%. When a state approves that same 1% salary increase for our institutions, it's funded at a proportion. For our TCATs, 80%, for our community colleges, 66%, for our universities, 55%. The remaining balance for each one of those dollars is made up through tuition. So if it's a 5% increase, there is functionally some amount of tuition increase that has to happen. Sorry, if there's a 5% salary increase, there's some amount of tuition increase that has to happen in order for most of our institutions to be able to make that salary. This is go ahead.
Fee increases or operating cuts to get that.
True.
A lot of their operating is, of course, salary, so that's kind of harder to cut.
Thank you. Yeah. I have here a quick graphic to talk about how our model works. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but it helps us get at some of the core tenets. So if we look at the appropriation revenue from FY24, our current fiscal year, we have $1.5 billion in appropriations and $1.7 in tuition. This is for all of our formula units. Combined, $3.2 billion in total revenue from these sources. We take that core CPI I talked about, that 4.4%, and we estimate our total revenue need for the year, $141 million, to remain revenue neutral, controlling for inflation. That is split out between the appropriation estimate that we have for FY25. I talked about that $17 million. We don't have a specific salary request in this file, but in order to estimate where we might land on tuition, you kind of have to make a salary assumption. And so for the purposes of the thought exercise that we're about to do, we're estimating a 3% salary increase, which would equate to about $41 million for a combined $58 million. That leaves you with an estimated tuition revenue need of $83 million. What you'll find is if you take that 1.7 billion that's in the bottom left-hand corner and divide it by the 83 million that's in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll actually get a 0 to 5% range. And that would work if the institutional financial needs were evenly distributed. If all of our colleges had the same financial needs. We of course know that that is not the case. And so when we look at it and we have that 0 to 6% range, that extra percent is baked into the model and allows us to make sure that every institution, or most institutions anyway, would have the opportunity to remain revenue neutral, adjusted for inflation. Last year, or in May, when we all met, the board voted on a 0 to 3% range for all institutions. That was combined with $112 million in appropriations and a 6.3% core CPI. This year, with our request of $17 million for outcomes and an assumed 3% salary increase, the tuition model suggests 0 to 6%. This considers stable enrollment and 4.4 core CPI. So a few more data points I want to touch on lightly before we get to our conversation. And the first one that you see here is data from SHIO, which is our national coordinating body for all higher education agencies. What we're seeing here is the percent of total operating that is actually paid by dollars coming out of a student's pocket. So if I were to take this is 2 years, all of the 2-year schools in Tennessee, look at their total operating, subtract out appropriations, not just in the form of operating dollars, but in the form of scholarships as well, and federal aid, what you would be left with is how much the students are actually paying. And what we see is that Tennessee is about the second lowest in the nation. Functionally, what this graph shows us is something we all kind of knew. Our community college students, or 2-year students rather, do not pay very much in tuition to go to school. That's the whole point of the Promise and Reconnect programs. What that means for this conversation when we think about increasing tuition, our students at a 2-year school are less likely to actually realize the tuition increases that are passed along, right? Most of those dollars will be picked up in forms of other aid. There are real costs for these students to consider: housing, food, transportation, again, the list. But in terms of tuition, it tends not to be passed on to them in the same way that it would, for instance, at our 4-year schools. Same graphic, same data, looking at our 4-year institutions, we know that roughly half of every dollar that goes to our 4-year institutions is actually coming from a paying student. That makes more sense. There's larger prices and less aid for a lot of these students. Where that puts us in the landscape of the US is roughly in the middle, right? We are certainly doing better than some of the peer states around us, looking at Kentucky, Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, but maybe not as well as some of the other states, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Again, for the purposes of this conversation, what it means is that tuition increases are more likely to be realized by those 4-year students in some way or another. 2 more data points for you. This one's a little confusing. What I want you to know is that 1 is the best and 50th is the worst. So when we're 6th, that's pretty good, right? What we know is that very few of our community college students actually take on debt, but even for those who do, that debt tends to be much lower than in states around us. That is not the same story at our 4-year institutions. We are, once again, sort of middle of the pack. Our 4-year institutions, we do have more students who are taking on debt, and in looking at that total debt that they have, it's much higher than we see at the community colleges. This is a small subsection, right? It's students who took out federal debt and graduated. So I want to make that clear that we are talking about a smaller subsection of students that we're able to measure here. But for those students, what we can see is our community colleges are doing very well in keeping costs down for students. The universities are average with the nation. I think I have 2 more for you, and then I'll turn it over. Net price by year, another way for us to estimate how these are affecting students. Again, a similar story. Net price tends to be higher at our universities than the SRAB, the Southern Regional Educational Board, those peer states around us. Our community college net price is much lower than the states around us. Last one, a look at what states around us have done on tuition in the last couple of years. And there's a lot of different models here. North Carolina has held tuition flat for both 2 and 4 years for a long time now. Kentucky has had mild increases or set to 0 in the 2-year sector, slightly larger increases at the 4-year sector. Something of interest that Kentucky does, and that I've certainly heard interest from our CFOs on, is being able to bank unused tuition increases. For instance, if the board were to vote on a 4% increase this year and a 2% increase last year, well, let's say that somebody did 2% this year, they could roll that over into the next year. That's how Kentucky operates with their 4-year institutions. Missouri does not have a tuition cap, and so you see everything. Some institutions doing 0, some doing 20+%, true both at the 2 and 4-year levels. Unlike in previous years, we don't have an official recommendation for you all to vote on. Of course, I shared with you all already, the model suggests 0 to 6% when we put everything into it. Thinking about your job today and the board's job tomorrow, you have a couple of options, and it's very similar to how this happened in May. You could vote on that 0 to 6, which is sort of balancing student needs and institutional finances. You could expand that range and pass this power on to the individual boards, system boards, or the LGIs, or you could contract that range in and pass those savings on to students, asking institutions to find cuts elsewhere. With that, I'll leave this conversation to you all to discuss where the board might want to be. I'm here for questions. You have a cheat sheet in front of you to tell you what each % increase would look like at the TCATs, community colleges, universities.
Dan Thomerin, just maybe a quick procedural understanding on my part. I apologize if I'm not up to speed here. So Focus Act requires us to issue binding ranges, or binding range, correct? What you're offering to us is not establishing a range for us, but giving us sort of guidance to consider. But then we would still impose that on the colleges and universities as a binding range, whatever we decide. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the binding range is in statute. The guiding range, and correct me here, is in practice. And so what we are doing here in this guiding range is helping our institutions understand, because they are going to begin budgeting for FY25. Well, heck, they probably already have begun budgeting for FY25. A huge piece of that is tuition. We typically vote in May. That's pretty late for our institutions to be budgeting for FY25. So this whole exercise is for us to give the institutions something that they can use to estimate where they're going to be at going into the next fiscal year.
As you say in the materials here, on tab, on the bottom of the first page, it talks about THEC formula model suggests a tuition range of 0 to 6%, which you stated is a guiding tuition range. Say further on the next page, staff recommends the commission adopt a tuition and fee ranges as guidance only, with flexibility to approve the final binding ranges later in the fiscal year, once clarity on the state budget and overall impact on higher education is determined.
That is correct. So the guiding range is guiding for institutions, but to your point, also guiding for the board. To my understanding, there's nothing that would bind you to voting on the same range in May. Historically, that has happened, or the tweaks have been pretty small.
It could be that, for instance, as in a prior year, the legislature comes up with a bunch of money and wants to pay down the rate, basically.
Correct, yes.
So maybe it'll end up being 0. Who knows? So, all right. This whole thing, though, to me, we all remember, all the commissioners remember, as I do, Commissioner Frank Watson, who is famous for always wanting to have a 0 rate. He was very consistent in his approach to this. And so, I wonder what our policy is in regard to this, overall. As such, you describe some of the factors that y'all look at, setting this and everything, but it's an intriguing area, to say the least. So, any thoughts or anything about Commissioner Coben or Commissioner Stafford?
At this point, I think the schools need a number they can plug in so they can prepare their budgets. You don't want to go too high, because that will cause them to have to back up later on, scramble. You don't want to go too low, because that's not realistic. I would say somewhere in the 0, 3, or 4% range myself.
Just ever give any thoughts about the situation?
The 6% as the high end, tell me a little bit more about how you all got it.
So what will happen in any given year, we'll look at the tuition and appropriation levels that are dictated by the formula. We look at our request for the year, and we do this for all institutions. So every university has their own column in this sheet, as do the TCATs, as do the community colleges. We do an enrollment projection. Right now, we're estimating roughly stable enrollment. We've kind of plateaued as a system, and so that stable enrollment then means that enrollment doesn't affect the model as much as it might in other years. What you're doing then is looking at the appropriations level through the formula and what is that revenue needed to then remain revenue neutral, adjusted for inflation for the next year. So an institution that did better in the formula would need a lower tuition increase in this given year. An institution that did worse in the formula would need a greater tuition increase in this year to remain revenue neutral.
And I've heard that some of the LGIs are concerned that THEC's not offering enough latitude to them to actually run their budgets the way they should. How do we consider that? Are we factoring that in to give them enough latitude? Does the 0 to 6, in your view, provide that type of latitude for them to kind of have the room they need to increase their tuition rates to the level they think is appropriate, but still within reason and maintaining an affordable college education?
I believe it would. I've talked to just about every CFO in the state over the last 2 weeks on this specific issue. I don't expect that you would find one who, let's say that you expanded beyond 6. Probably not going to get a lot of people who take you up on that. And for the same reasons that this board has concerns. Our institutions, their boards are also thinking about students, thinking about costs, thinking about remaining somewhat competitive in this higher education marketplace. It tends not to be in their best interest to do something like a 10% increase year over year. But what we have seen with our lower tuition increases is that the boards, the LGIs, typically have to be pretty close to the top of our range to make the math work in any given year. We haven't necessarily seen the institutional boards be able to put their thumbprint on this. For instance, if it were 0 to 6, I expect you'd see some institutions come in very much on the low end of that, and you'd see some institutions come in towards the top of that. That's not, neither one of those is necessarily the right or wrong strategy. That's up to the boards, their CFOs, the presidents to decide what the strategy would be.
Just one more question. Treasurer Lillard invoked Frank Watson's name, and one of the things that Commissioner Watson would often bring up is the fact that he didn't feel that colleges and universities were doing enough to contain costs and to leverage technology. How do we factor any of that in, or at least do what we can to encourage colleges and universities to really factor those aspects into their overall costs or revenue needs?
It's a great question. So on cost containment, we are tracking this through things like the operating budgets, which we share with you all twice a year, looking at how our institutions are spending their money. We presented on that in August. We'll be presenting on it again in January. In terms of cost containment, we certainly are checking in with our CFOs pretty regularly with this exact question. What are the things that you're able to save on, and how are you doing that? We know that most institutions in our states actually have to run reasonably lean. I shared that CFI data, the Composite Financial Index, and said we have a 20-year history. This is, this most recent fiscal year, the best we have in that 20-year history. And there are certainly years in that 20-year history where the data are not especially pretty, right? Our institutions are doing well right now. I don't know if I were to take the 5 or 10-year view of that, how confident I could be in, say, putting my money down on that. And so it's a real concern from them. The technology piece of this, how do we use technology to bring our costs down? This was a huge conversation, especially, I think, leading up to the pandemic. And it's tricky. I think our assumptions tends to be more technology can help bring our college costs down. I can put 100 students, 200 students, 1,000 students in a virtual class with one or maybe two instructors. I think what we found through the pandemic is that there aren't maybe that many students who are interested in that model of learning. Certainly there are some, but we saw a great hunger from our students to be back on campus during the pandemic. Two, I think there's a lot of students for whom online learning is a valuable piece of their whole education, but it's difficult. A lot of students struggle to learn in that setting. Thinking even about my own experiences, I don't know how successful I would have been in a 1,000-person class with two instructors. And so the idea is sound, but it's difficult to maybe implement with fidelity.
Let me ask one other question here about this. Do reserves figure into this equation at all, the operating reserves of universities or other institutions?
The operating reserves figure into the health of the institution, that slide I showed earlier on. The reserves do not necessarily figure in here. And so what you would probably see, and I think sort of part of this question, if you were, the math suggests, again, maybe 0 to 6, if you were to come in on the low end of that, institutions might be able to, for some amount of time, balance the budget with reserves. That's a strategy you could do for a year, maybe two. It's not a 10-year strategy for our institutions.
Well, I would suggest it would be interesting to look into in the future. Of course,
Yes.
there's no time to do that now, but in the future, what a typical operating model is for a community college, and what the ratio should look like. In Tennessee's economic environment, they're pretty homogeneous for the most part, I think. The LGIs are a little different versus UT and all that, because they're different types of universities in terms of their mission, but we all look more at what we consider to be a good range, like the type of institution it is, and its mission and its charge, et cetera, and then also the financial health of the institution. I don't have a personal problem at this point with the 0 to 6 range that the staff recommended as a guiding range at this point. You might want to consider saying a little bit less than 6% from the standpoint of making sure that we're keeping it reasonable.
Mr. Chair, if I may, we are bringing in front of you what our tuition model is putting out in front of you. The same tuition model we've had since I believe 2007, 2008. If we are bringing in front of you a recommendation, which we're not doing right now, I too don't know if we would come to you with 0 to 6% because I bet Frank Watson in the back of my mind right haunting me right now. That I get that. I think THEC right now is at a crossroads with conversations we've had at the last commission meeting as well, which is should we have a higher cap to have institutions respond to what the market needs are? Is that the direction we want to go? Do we just want to follow strictly the model that's in front of us? Or do we go with the lower range and eye towards student affordability? If we go with the lower range, we are implicitly saying as a commission, hey, you need to either find other ways to increase revenue, out of state, graduate enrollment, online enrollment, or find other cuts to make that work. And so I do want to just clarify that we are not coming as staff to say we recommend 0 to 6%. It's just what the math is making for us.
Well, and we've lost our quorum here today, so we can't really learn the recommendation as such. The best we possibly do is say there's some kind of consensus on a point. But we'll just leave it where we report out that we had discussion on this point, and the staff can make their presentation. We'll see what the commission's will is when that's done. So, yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman. Russell, you said a few minutes ago, a school for whom did not receive quite as large of an appropriation might want to make up that difference into a tuition increase. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, it's less about actually the will of the school and more about just the math of the formula. So, yeah.
Yeah, so, but I would assume the schools that found themselves in that pickle, the last thing they need to do is raise tuition, because what they really need is to get those students in there and get those degrees completed, or certificates, or whatever they are. Would that be correct?
This is the battle, right? Because our institutions need money to function well, and institutions certainly that have more money are often able to function better. They have two options for getting more money, generally, appropriations and tuition. And so this is about, we see a number of our universities, certainly at our community colleges, the margins are thin. And so certainly you don't want to pass that cost on to students, but also to best serve your students, you do need some amount of money to keep the lights on, to keep things moving forward.
There are certain fixed costs, I understand that. And I think what we think of in this body most of the time is programs are where the elasticity exists. Because if you're not getting students in, is the program really viable? And do we want to continue to spend money there? And I don't think at this level we're in any kind of position to make that call. The schools have to do that. But I'm really kind of getting in this morning's committee's territory here. But it still affects the dollars that comprise the school's profile. I hate to even say this word, but do you know if any of our schools actually conduct a zero-based budgeting approach?
I do not know.
Or do they start with what we're fixed? And this is what's already in the pot, this is how we keep going, and then from there, what do we want to do? Does this stuff ever get
I've had some good conversations with CFOs in the past about that. Most of our institutions do not do that. It's incremental. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to speak to this in the audience, but I know that there's been conversation about this in the past. Like when a new CFO comes in, would it be good to do zero budgeting? But I wouldn't say all would do.
Yeah.
There's actually a zero-based budgeting statute on the books for state government, but I don't know that we really. I'll just make that observation. So, all right, okay, so we'll proceed in that manner that I outlined. Just tell them we've got discussion on this and the staff can get their report tomorrow. Okay, the next item is item 4, the capital projects recommendations.
Good afternoon, Paul Marshall, Senior Director of Facility Planning and Preparedness. Real quickly, we're going to go through this. Okay, there we go. So what this, and I'm just going to hit the wave tops here. Any questions you have, we can go deeper. But to just quickly talk about this, this is sort of the annual process, the timeline that goes through for capital. So every year in January, we send out the instructions to the SBAs. We make sure that they're fully set up and understand how to fill out, and how can I put this? We give them all the information that we can to inform them of what has been successful submittals in the past. So we work with them through January, through July, or through May, and then into July, when they send their submittals to us. Up until the point in time where they submit them to us, we can have calls, we work with them, we go through everything, but then once we receive them, that's sort of the end of the discussion at that point, and then we make our assessments, and the reviewers work with what we have. But so we go from July to September, we go through the process of an independently read and scored review process. This year, we had 7 reviewers, 4 from THEC, 3 from outside. But they go through that, and then in September is a non-negotiable date for us. F&A, we have to turn the submittals over to F&A. So that's sort of how that works. So that date doesn't move. Whether THEC's asking for it or not, that information has to go to F&A. Then we go to November, and here we are. And these recommendations come forward to you all. And then it leaves the commission and then goes to the governor's budget. So you have sort of January to January timeline there. We move forward to May for legislative approval, and then obviously you all will see it in July at the SBC for whatever funding is approved. So that's just a brief overview for those that might not sort of see the cyclical annual nature of the timeline. So the process supports projects that are sort of most appropriate for the state and the institutions and are fully ready to start design with sort of minimal changes, and make sure that when the project is funded, they're ready to hit the ground running. Talking about that, sort of the process as we go through. So these 4 issues at the top, the mission, the vision, the values, and the strategic plan, those sort of inform everything that goes in, or I should say the mission, vision, and values inform the strategic plan. The capital process submission follows the same format every year. So these drive the campus plan, the feasibility studies, the facility program. You can imagine, if you will, that the mission, vision, and values informing the strategic plan then inform the campus master plan. The campus master plan gives each institution the ability to, in a very rigorous way, know what their priorities need to be, which then will drive into feasibility studies to see what those priorities would look like if they pursued them. Once the feasibility study is completed and they know where they want to direct their attention, their priority, that then drives the facility program. So it's important to understand those steps, because if you look at our rubric, which, by the way, this year in the packets that you all received, off to the side, you saw what that rubric looks like as a more transparent way of breaking down the scores. But those first three elements are driven by this. I would argue from a professional perspective in architecture, there would be no way to assemble, or it would be very difficult to assemble a project to come forward without having gone through these first three steps. And so that sort of sets you up for all the fiscal and financial requests, the stakeholder engagement, everything necessary to ensure that when a project comes forward, it's ready. And then finally, the space needs is sort of, which is the fourth rubric in the process, is what drives the architectural design and ensures that you're teed up for that. So those steps inform that, and then the stakeholder groups have solidified the program. In addition to that, or following on from that, this sort of talks about sort of how those drive across, and then all these elements that are part of the submittal here are what's driven by the feasibility studies, and the facility program especially goes over here, and then again the space needs drives the architectural design. Finally, we have what we call the Physical Facilities Inventory and Survey, or the PFIS as we refer to it, and very soon when we get the information from UT, we will have a complete end-to-end database of every bit of square footage that is higher education square footage for E&G space statewide, to the point of it's on a building by building basis and on a building system basis as well. So we know the conditions of all of our institutional structures down to the ages and everything else. So it's going to be, and it is as it exists, but once we get UT's data, I will say it's complete. It's a complete database to know what we have and what to predict and what to look at. It's a planning tool for renovations. Part of the PFIS is sort of this 4-quadrant chart. If you can imagine, sort of along the bottom of the chart, there's a physical conditions, and sort of along the vertical axis of the chart, it's the fit for use. And so that creates a scatter chart that we can export out of PFIS, or that any of the institutions can pull up, and they can then very quickly see sort of where their priorities are. And typically, if you can imagine that matrix, in the lower left corner, those are sort of those are the buildings that would need to be divested or looked at for demolition. It also obviously identifies deferred maintenance per building system and on a campus basis, because they're rated on a numerical system. So not having to go too deep into that, but just so you know, we have that as a tool for the institutions to use. So very quickly, I'm going to go into the 12 projects. There were 12 projects this year. All of them are recommended. As always, THEC, as I've already mentioned, we had the independently read and scored 7 raters, and the projects were scored based on their median score.
Let me ask you about that slide there, the one you just
Yes,
had
sir.
there. The bottom one there about deferred maintenance, the bottom bullet point you got there. Do y'all actually inventory deferred maintenance that's out there? You know, for instance, I used to, as a financial lawyer, used to represent AutoZone Corporation in Philadelphia, their treasury department, and they had a deal where they surveyed, they own their own real estate. All of the stores you see around the country are owned by AutoZone, and they have the life of every roof, of every parking lot, of all of these things. They got it down to the last degree, and they know when it's going to expire in their view and when it's got to be replaced, and it just cycles into the budget cycle just like that. So do y'all do that sort of thing, or does the institutions do that?
We have the ability to see the condition of those systems based on industry best practices and knowing what those lives would be. we can certainly make that assessment. You want to say anything more about that?
Yes, well, this is a key element to understanding overall deferred maintenance and how the institutions may have the tools they need to develop the priorities and do the cost assessments in the future. So it's directly related to the topic of the amount that's funded from year to year. So we do an analysis of what would be recommended for capital funding, which is approximately 2% of the replacement value. We use a different formula we call the Sherman-Durgis formula, which is very close to that 2%. But the state, of course, will fund on an irregular basis what that maintenance is. It makes it difficult for the institutions to be able to predict or plan those out years for when they need to be doing replacements. I think many of them will tell you that they run a system to fail, is what they may do. And that is because of the lack of predictability and the varying amount. And so we're looking at what that gap is in the actual funding, and also the gap in understanding about what the state may feel the institutions should be spending on capital maintenance, and what the institutions feel the state should be funding.
Well, we all know as government people that the first thing that gets cut in a lean budget year is maintenance, okay, capital maintenance and all that, because it's not felt immediately. But on the other hand, you know, if there's a quantification of the amount of it that's out there, the true amount of it and all that, then at least gives you a score as where you are on the whole thing as you're pointing out.
And we do have it. As Patty pointed out, we've got the formula that does that predictive amount. And it's worth noting that over the past 5 years, we did an exercise to actually compare the formulaic prediction versus the actual delta. So we looked back at the past 5 years and how much capital maintenance was funded in each year, what that total was versus what the predicted amount was. And so that delta actually ended up being almost identically compared to the numbers from the PFAS as to what that predicted 2% amount was. It was, I think, within 2% of each other. You know, I mean, over $600 million, it was, you know, almost next to one another. So for the deferred maintenance, for critical deferred maintenance, right? So the formula works. Is I guess that what proved to us, it was the first time I've actually seen real data and predicted data be held next to one another and see it that close.
All right, sorry to hold you up there. Just wanted to ask that question.
Absolutely, that's why we're here. So very quickly, I'm going to go over the 12 projects. The first project is the University of Tennessee Knoxville Chemistry Building. This project provides office and state-of-the-art research space for 123 graduate teaching assistants who in the 26 to 27 capital year will provide chemistry instruction to approximately 14,000 chemistry and non-chemistry majors, both in the new building and in Strong Hall. It'll serve all the chemistry academic courses supporting the attainment of BS, certified BS, MS, PhD, and the undergraduate minors across 80 plus degrees. And so that will bring over 1,200 students into the new building. The second project is the MTSU Liberal Arts Archives and Museum building, which is this proposed project provides a state-of-the-art classroom facility that will serve MTSU's academics and strengthen broader community outreach and engagement. The number 3 project is the ETSU Brown Hall renovation phase 2, which is the second phase. It's currently in design and construction. Funding is really needed to maintain the continuity of the project schedule. The building houses academic, classroom, laboratory, and research facilities for the biological sciences, chemistry, physics, and astronomy, and many of these spaces have really become outdated. The number 4 project is the Volunteer State Community College TCAP Hartsville Wilson County Higher Education Center. This is Vol State's community plan for a Wilson County campus that provides significant support to address the core elements of the THEC 2015 to 25 master plan, while also addressing the priorities outlined in the Complete College Tennessee Act and the Drive to 55, which is going to provide an opportunity to support the core essence of the THEC master plan and increasing educational attainment levels of Tennessee, and also enhancing the state's economic and workforce development goals. The number 5 project is the Tennessee Tech Academic Classroom Building. This is a capital project for almost a 1-for-1 square foot replacement between what's being demolished and what's being replaced. It's within 1% of the amount of square footage being removed. So That's a great thing, because that's really what we've been encouraging, is whenever you replace with new square footage, as much as possible, remove square footage and take it offline if you're not using effectively. It will offer the various things. So in 2 Tennessee Tech departments of social science, it will offer high demand general education courses, and it'll contribute to communities across Tennessee via outreach and graduates in such areas as social work, mental health counseling, law enforcement, and school counseling. The number 6 project is the University of Tennessee Chattanooga Fletcher Hall addition and renovation. This project represents the University of Tennessee Chattanooga's vision of a post-pandemic educational facility. It bridges the design and technology gap between the modern classroom and the future workplace, and it's made possible by a $30 million gift by Gary and Kathleen Rollins, which will renovate the existing Rollins College of Business in Fletcher, and with the addition will double the amount of teaching spaces. Number 7 is the University of Tennessee Health Science Center Gross Anatomy Lab renovation. UT Health Science has an institutional goal of attracting and matriculating the best and brightest Tennessee professional school students. As our contemporary research has shown, the opportunity to engage in cadaveric dissection of cadavers is an important factor in the selection of medical schools by prospective medical students. And it has become not just a rite of passage, but the cornerstone of their knowledge for medical, dental, physician assistant, nursing, and many other professional students in healthcare. And the existing facilities that they're operating in now are somewhat antiquated, and the renovation will support the increase in the number of healthcare providers in the state's workforce. Number 8 is the TSU new engineering building. A critical need of the university is to eliminate the use of antiquated space and consolidate some academic functions into one singular building. The new building will address both issues for the college with the demolition of Torrance Hall and with the consolidation of these programs within a single building. Number 9 is the University of Memphis Research Modernization Project. As you may know, in December of 2021, the university announced that it had been named an R1 institution by the Carnegie Classification Institutions of Higher Education, and receiving their R1 rating requires the modernization of research labs as well as the movable and fixed equipment that supports them. Improvements to infrastructure and systems, all the systems, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, and investments in cutting-edge technologies will protect both the safety of the students and will also increase academic outcomes. Number 10 is the TCAT Shotover Lincoln County campus replacement. This campus will serve Lincoln County residents who currently have to drive between 15 to 35 miles to get to the closest TCAT. And since Lincoln County trails the state in degree attainment rates, the campus closer to the residents of the county could reduce the transportation barrier to post-secondary education. Number 11 is the Austin Peay State University Military Academic Building. The proposed facility is critical to the space needs of 4 unique programs: the Culinary Arts, Sports Communication and Broadcasting, ROTC, and the Institute of National Security and Military Studies. The facility will bring visibility to all the programs, and the teaching kitchen will foster new interest in potential community partnerships. And number 12 is the Robertson County, Sumner County campus replacement. The TCAT Nashville seeks to secure funding to increase training capacity in their northern service area. TCAT Nashville currently operates facilities in Sumner and Robertson counties, but is severely limited due to the quantity and space constraints of current facilities. So that sort of encompasses the totality of the 12 outlay projects for a total state recommendation of $861.6 million for those outlay projects. I'll pause there if there's any questions about outlay before we move on to demolitions.
Any questions?
Just one question, sort of a carryover of what we talked about earlier, is as the schools are putting forth their proposals for these new structures, how do we determine how much they have factored into their projections, the future demand, whether it's because the cliff is coming and the number of students will be less, or because there's a shift in what students are studying, or anything that may impact the need for the same building size that they're projecting?
So there are enrollment data projections that are involved in the rubric when they give the submittal to us, so that produces all of those. I would defer to the academic team if there's anything to add in that you haven't already heard or would like to dive deeper into, but they do submit enrollment projections. There are space needs projections. They look at what the deficiencies are on campus. where they would need to fill in. So there's a large amount of data and work that goes into building these submittals to make sure that they are looking at future needs. If that makes sense. And again, I'm happy to go any deeper if you'd like.
That helps, and it just at least gives me some perspective without getting into the details.
And that's again, when each of the independent reviewers reads and scores these, they're looking at all of that information. So it is very thoroughly researched and considered. Yes, ma'am.
If I may, for Commissioner staff, and a conversation that we have not had, but I'd love to have sometime. I asked staff in my call prior to tomorrow's meeting, thinking about hospitals when they want to move into a new area, they generally have to obtain a certificate of need, which is some kind of verification that in fact we do need this new establishment here. We can fill it with people in beds, et cetera. And that was what I asked Stephen, if in fact do we get certificates of need or something like that before we go and build a branch of a THEC or a branch of a community college or a satellite. And I think, given what you were just saying, that's what Stephen was trying to explain to me, is that in fact we do get that kind of assurance and information from the campus, and that they have looked at that and are required to do so.
And I know that when we, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when we have, as a commission, as a board, approved the TCAP master plan or various community colleges master plan, they have worked very closely with, what's his name? His name's the master planner for those.
Art Lizzie.
Yes, yeah. On doing those enrollment projections, on better identifying what are the true needs in these areas of whole across the state. I'm not sure to what extent that happens with other master plans. I defer to them here, but that level of analysis and looking forward toward the demographic cliff, to what extent that impacts Tennessee is factored into the master plan, and all these buildings are in the master plan as well.
Yeah, it's worth noting that in the submittal and all of the different sections that they submit back to us from our request, there is very much a defense, and they explain how that enrollment is going to increase or what the steps are going to go to, even to the point of bringing all of that data together. We don't rely on, as someone used to just say, it's not a if we build it, they will come, but there's actual rigorous metrics that go into proving how they get to that point. The same thing goes into space needs, into how they're going to handle movement on campus to actually handle the migration from building to building. So they go through it. The really, really excellent submittals go through it very detailed, but everyone goes through it at varying levels to explain all those components.
So Paul, you don't think that the Lincoln County, if we build it, they will come? You don't think that applies there?
I will defer to others in the room if they like. I think that over time, all of the submittals have gotten better and better and better since the Focus Act happened. So I'm not saying that Lincoln County is not a good project. I'm saying that in comparison to the other projects, it didn't score by its median as well as the others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a valid and good project. Again, worth noting that all 12 projects are recommended.
And I just want to pass out a compliment to staff. Having the rubric in the material was outstanding. That was a great move.
Okay, if there's no other questions on outlay, I'll move on to the other sort of supporting things of demolition and maintenance. The next component here is, that's a roll up there, but at the bottom.
It's not been said enough today, but I thank you for that feedback. I also want to give a thanks to Bob Smith, our interim executive director up until September. A lot of what we've heard today from academic program changes and post-approval monitoring, which you guys have been a part of, but also making things transparent, that came under his leadership. And so a thanks to him, if he's watching.
Yeah.
If he's not, well, I have yet to give him the gratitude that he deserves today. So.
So what we've got here, the demolitions for $5.5 million, is important to note that that's capital demolitions outside of an outlay project. And the reason that that's important to understand is because we allow an institution to submit demolitions as part of an outlay project if the demolition of that existing structure or whatever is in support of building the outlay project. However, what they cannot do as to include with an outlay project is say, well, we're going to build this building over here, but, across campus, we also want to take down this parking garage or whatever. That's not allowed because they're not directly connected for the same program. So what this $5.5 million is a request to take down actually it's 12 buildings, across these campuses at ETSU, TSU, Memphis, and UT, and remove them, but not part of an outlay project. However, it's important to note that they're going to be taking down 207,000 square feet, and it's over $525,000 of annual operations and maintenance that currently is allocated for these structures. So the approval of that, and whatever that ROI is of 525,000 into 5.5 million, is what that short time frame would be for a payback. So we encourage them because obviously if there's ever space that's not being utilized, it's better to either divest or demolish. So just quickly wanted to kind of point that out and why that's not included in the outlay. Capital maintenance, there's 104 projects for a total cost of $251.5 million. We have in the packets that you've seen broken out the TCAP projects separately just for more visibility to kind of highlight them. But those 10 TCAP projects, which also includes 2 out-year projects. So there's actually 8 current fiscal year projects and 2 out-year projects for TCAPs. That's included in the overall 104 projects. So we put it that way. We go back to what we talked about earlier about the Sherman-Durgis formula, which is how we would predict what annual funding would be needed to basically avoid deferred maintenance. And the actual calculated value for this fiscal year is actually $323 million, but 251.5 is an actionable, ready to go number. So even though we acknowledge the 2, that's what we're bringing forward. Included under the definition of capital maintenance are 2 other requests, 2 recommendations rather, and that is $117.4 million for ADA. This would be a one-time ask that would go to the effort of distributing to all the campuses improvements to their ADA accessibility projects. We've worked with them rigorously with each of the campuses, got a list of projects of what they feel is the number that they need to remedy their ADA issues. And so that's what represents this. So this would not be a recurring year-to-year ask. This would be $117.4 million to distribute to the campuses that should ameliorate all of their accessibility concerns. Finally, as part of the capital maintenance definition, we do have $28 million in there for safety and security. This is based off of the reports that were done in 2021 by the Department of Safety and Homeland Security in conjunction with THEC and the campuses to survey all of their campuses and produce a list of projects. The $28 million is not going to solve all that. As we heard last week, UT has almost $48 million alone in security projects. So this is a step in the right direction. It's certainly more than we've gotten before, and it will really get the ball rolling towards getting safety and security projects on campuses moved forward much more than the smaller funding that we've received in past years.
Is this things like bulletproof glass doors, electronic door opener?
It is. So we have these are identified projects. This is not just a randomly generated number. These are identified projects. They range from security cameras, lighting, access control, like you were mentioning, electronic locking. One of the primary, if not the primary focus and recommendation from Homeland Security is classroom locks that can be locked from within the classroom. So this includes classroom locks, but it also does include laminate film, which is what you're referring to as the ballistic defeat, sort of entry to turret film that can be placed on main entrances. So that's all included in this.
Thank you.
Absolutely. The final thing that we need to present as part of this is the disclosure projects. As you all know, this is sort of just a pass-through reporting for THEC. There's 11 projects total, $263 million. 114 of which is TSSBA funding for the 2 projects. So there's 9 revenue funded and 2 TSSBA funded for that. And that is sort of the end of the capital, and I'm happy to answer any questions or go forward with any discussion.
Okay. No questions or discussion on these points or anything? I think for the future, from my perspective, it's like the TCATs. We go out there like we did one time with Dr. House and some of the staff and looked at some of the TCATs and everything, and there were buildings that were built in the 1960s, and there was a big explosion that really hadn't had much done to them except maintain them pretty well, in the meantime and everything. And so you have to ask yourself, is there something that we should be doing in the future to highlight that situation where you have building stock that's really beyond its obsolescence range and should be replaced, et cetera, and how we approach that. So that sort of thing is an issue for commission in the future, I think.
Happy, and we've got the data tools to sort of provide that information for the discussion to occur.
Right.
Mr. Chair, I think I just want to add that we have on the calendar for December 8th, I believe, an initial capital task force in which we are bringing together institutional heads as well as members of the State Building Commission. We have an invitation for that as well.
Okay.
To review our capital process for the fiscal year 25-26, what should change, what needs to change, and that's really been something that's been identified as partially shifting towards what are the general needs that we see out there for higher education, but how we can make this process even stronger than it is certainly what I'd like to do in the coming months.
Well, you got that, what I mentioned, and then also you got the issue of just like the TBR system as a whole isn't permitted to bring more than 3 projects to the board, for consideration and all that. And so that's a question mark about whether that should be done differently in some way. There's some good reason for it because the General Assembly and the governor only have so much money every year, and so, but, on the other hand, there's a need to quantify what's out there and what really needs to be dealt with so that everyone's clearly got it in their minds what the future costs are going to be here, going forward. Sure. Okay, any other discussion points about this? All right, I'll just report that we had a discussion on this issue, and I think we have one other item on the agenda, the financial and statistical reporting policy amendments.
1 hour.
Oh, excellent. Well, hello and good afternoon. My name is Jacob Kamer, and I am THEC's data strategist. For your consideration today, I'll be presenting a recommended policy amendment to THEC's financial and statistical reporting policies. And in your commission meeting materials, you should have both a redlined and a clean version of the amendment. In sum, the amendment clarifies language to better align policy with practice, and it establishes a data governance steering committee to standardize and to modernize our procedures relative to data, including data collection, data integration, data analysis, and data sharing. The policies with revision are noted on the screen. The most significant changes pertain to policies 30B and 30C. Revisions to policy 30B refine the language of the policy to reflect the action that actually occurs. In 30C, this is a new provision that establishes a data governance steering committee. Data governance, of course, is the formalized process by which an organization, really any organization, makes and enacts decisions about its data. The amendment also includes a number of minor revisions. These include a revision to policy 30D to reference the data governance steering committee recommended in policy 30C. It also includes the removal of the term course from policies 20 and 30G. THEC is actively considering how it collects course level information from institutions and systems, but because course enrollment is a measure of enrollment and enrollment is already specified in the policy, we felt that this is somewhat redundant. So our recommendation relative to those is just to streamline the policy language. And with that, that really concludes my comments. So I will open it up if you have any questions for me about the amendment.
Sounds pretty short to the point.
Very straightforward. Just to add 30 seconds to the big reason for this is that back in 2016, 2017, with focus, it was put in a statute that THEC will decide when the LGIs can sever from TBR to submit data to TBR. We have yet to do that. And the reason why we've not done that is because we don't have the infrastructure in place as far as processes to validate the quality of data coming from more than 2 sources. This is a step in that direction to get us there. So I'm excited. I'm really excited for it. As dry and black and white as it can be, I'm really excited for it. So thank you.
Okay, so we had a discussion about this point. So, anything further to come before us today? Seeing none, assume there's no objection to adjournment, so we will adjourn.